All right, so that's about as long as I want to wait. If anybody comes in now, we'll try and get them in, but I can't promise that I'll spot them. So we're out in the shop today, but before we get going, I want to show you what is on today's page. So we'll switch over to whatever you want to call it. Okay, so for today, basically what we're doing is just going over some basic terminology. We're going to start today with the differences between solid stock and sheet goods. There's a document here that I don't know why I sat there and drew it up last night. It's got a bunch of information about basic terminology, solid stock versus sheet goods. What happens when solid material expands and contracts, such as bows, crooks, cups, twists, little things that go wrong. Some basics about sheet goods, the pros and cons. It also talks about some of the things that we'll deal with over the course of the next week. So I just kind of kept going and blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot there, but we're not going to worry about it all today. That's also available not just under the Tuesday deal here, but this little inset one here, it's just the same thing, just more than one way to get to it, okay? So today, all right, first thing we're going to talk about is sheet goods, okay? We basically have two types of material here in the shop that we use, solid stock and sheet goods. When I talk about sheet goods, I'm talking about man-made items, something that's not as it would be directly off of a tree, okay? So sheet goods come in a lot of different forms. It can be laminated pieces, added up, right? Thin piece by thin piece by thin piece by thin piece, all stacked up to make what we call a veneer or a plywood, okay? Plywood's just basically made up of a bunch of different layers, oftentimes faced with something that's not quite as bad looking as the core parts. But sheet goods can also be something, so this would be known as VC core plywood or veneer core plywood. These are individual thin veneers that make up the inner core of the plywood. We have things like, you guys that have been in here all have seen particle board, okay? It's basically a bunch of small particles of leftover sawdust that's compressed with an adhesive. It's compressed pressure and heat with an adhesive and creates particle board. A particle board can also have a different surface on the face. And here's an example of a melamine, right? It's got a plastic type of, I don't know if you'd call it phenolic or a plastic on the faces of this to hide particle board interior. There's also, where'd my MDF go? There it is. This is a type of sheet good. This is called MDF, also known as medium density fiberboard. This is also sold in an LDF and an HDF version, low density and high density fiberboard. So this is real similar to particle board, but the pieces that make this up are a lot finer. It's a lot heavier than particle board, and it's got some other benefits and drawbacks that we'll talk about here in a minute. So like I said, plywoods can be a lot of different inner cores. They can be veneer core, that you can have something like this piece of cherry veneer that has a particle board core or an MDF core. So in other words, all these other guys like particle board and MDF can have a face on them, a good face on them. So let's start with just the least desirable, but probably one of the most prevalent sheet goods around, and that's particle board, okay? So like I said, it's a bunch of little chunks of sawdust or leftover. So if I try to take some of this off, I take a knife, okay? It doesn't come off in long pieces. It comes off as just really a bunch of little sawdusty kind of stuff, okay? It's not very pleasant, to be honest with you. A couple of benefits of particle board. It's inexpensive, okay? okay? It's not very expensive at all. In fact, there's a very good chance, it's quite likely that you have something in your home, some piece of furniture that has a particle board core. Just about anything you might get at, say, for example, Walmart, Fred Meyer, things like that. Even IKEA has a lot of particle board core furniture. Like I said, the benefits are that it's inexpensive. It's really stable. And when I mean stable, what I mean is, when I say stable, what I mean is it doesn't warp, twist, cup, anything like that. It stays flat. And that's important when it comes to furniture. A couple of drawbacks of this stuff is you don't want to get it wet. It's going to swell up pretty bad if you get it wet. The other thing that's really bad about this stuff is it's not very strong. Okay, it can be broken quite easily, and it's just this ugly mess at the break point. It's just really weak stuff. You can literally drop this stuff on the floor and it can sometimes break. It will take a routed edge, okay? In other words, you can take a router bit, similar to this thing right here, and you can profile the edge and put a decorative edge on it. Okay, this is just an OG router bit. This is an example right here on this MDF. I'm going to zoom that in a little bit so you can see it. And I'm going to go that way a little bit. Okay, so you can kind of see the decorative edge here on this piece of MDF. It's done by a router bit. Okay, so you can route a particle board. The problem is, once you route an edge on this stuff, there's not much else you can do. You can't cover it with a veneer. You can paint it, but the routed edge of particle board doesn't take paints or finishes well at all. You're going to see the rough surface of the particle board once it's done. Like I said, it soaks up water pretty bad, so you don't want to get it wet. It can be painted, but it's not the prettiest stuff in the world. Next would be MDF, medium density fiberboard, okay? The nice thing about this stuff, it takes a routed edge very well, okay? You guys can't see that. All right, it routes very well. It can be painted very easily. Even the routed edge is gonna take paint very well. It's heavier than particle board, it's more dense, so it's heavier. It's still relatively inexpensive. But it does, and it's actually a lot stronger than particle board. It's a heck of a lot harder to bust this over the corner of a table edge than particle board is, so it's a lot sturdier. It's going to be quite a bit heavier. You make the same piece of furniture out of particle board, then make the same thing out of MDF, it's going to be heavier. One of the bigger drawbacks to MDF is, number one, its weight. Number two, if this thing gets wet at all, it's just going to swell up like crazy. It's going to blow up like a sponge. So you cannot put this in any kind of situation where it's going to be exposed to moisture. But it is stable. It's not going to warp. As long as it doesn't get wet, like soaking wet, it doesn't draw moisture in from a humid environment the way solid stock would. So it's got its benefits, it's got its drawbacks. It can also be used as a core for MDF or for veneers, hardwood veneers, things like that. In fact, it's fairly common as a core. Okay, so that's our really crummy, bad type of sheet goods. Next, we step up to some of the veneer core plywoods. In other words, something like this cherry. Okay, you should be able to see the different layers in here. Let me see if I'll zoom in on it a little bit. And over here, and if it'll ever focus, come on. It wants to focus on the panel saw behind me, so move over a little bit. There. Okay, so you should be able to see the individual layers in here. Hold on a second, I've got somebody trying to get in late. Let me try and get them in. This is what happens when people come in late, it's annoying. Okay, so there we go. All right, so veneer core plywoods. Most likely you guys have all seen a veneer plant or a VC plywood plant. And if you've ever driven to Medford, and just after you pass through Rogue River, on the left-hand side, you'll see the Murphy Plywood Mill. Basically what they do is they make veneer core plywood. Basically, what you see stacked outside of that plant are a bunch of these real thin veneers or layers sitting out there. So what they do is they take and they stack these layers up, one after the other. And depending on the overall desired thickness will determine the number of layers and the thickness of the individual layers that they have to put together to make a sheet. Now, what you should notice about this stuff is the grain direction. Okay, this is actually poplar, and it's a little less than 1/8 of an inch thick. It's probably, yeah, 3/16, or I mean, yeah, just under 1/8 inch thick. So look at the grain direction in this thing, okay? This thing is pretty strong when you try to bend it across the grain, okay? But if you try to bend it with the grain, it's incredibly weak. So what they can't do is stack these individual layers up like this with all the grain going in the same direction. It's a very, very weak lamination, okay? There's a lot of flex. But if I have these 4 or 5 pieces together and try to bend it across the grain, it's a lot stronger. So what they do is every piece, every individual layer, let's get these apart so I can do this. Every individual layer, they rotate the grain direction 90 degrees. So the first layer of grain's going this way, next layer, they're gonna go this way, and every other sheet, the grain direction will be 90 degrees, rotated 90 degrees. So obviously this is the shape of the L, it would be sized differently. So what this does is this gives a sheet of plywood strength in both directions. In other words, this way and this way. So it makes it a very strong, stable piece of material. So that's how they do basic veneer core plywood. So if you're building a house, the flooring, the roofing oftentimes can be a veneer core plywood, construction grade plywood. I don't have any construction grade plywood here, but it's what's known as ACX or CDX plywood. And it's what they use for subfloors and sometimes roofs. A lot of times they're using a different material called chipboard. But because it's stable, it's fairly inexpensive. But in the furniture industry, we don't want that look that you have in construction grade plywoods. What we want in the furniture industry is a much nicer, very, very thin layer on the faces of the plywood. Okay, so this is actually cherry veneer. So in the veneer world, when we talk about hardwood veneers, which is what this is, it's basically the regular construction grade type of layers in here, a little nicer. There's not as many voids and things like that, or gaps between the layers. And then they add a really, really super thin, nice layer of solid wood on both faces. Sometimes it's a single face that's really nice and the opposite face is not great. It's dependent on the grade of plywood that you're getting, whether it's a grade A, A1, A2, whatever it might be. So basically what this is a regular veneer core plywood made up of this kind of inner core with a nice thin piece of cherry on the outside. Problem with that is, okay, this veneer face, this hardwood veneer on the face of this is so thin. Bring this in a bit so you can see it. It is so thin right? This is the veneer face on it. Okay, it is incredibly thin. All right, it's 32nd of an inch or less thickness, and what's underneath is not necessarily the most attractive thing. So it's just this very thin layer of real cherry. It's regular solid wood cherry, but it's such a thin layer. Okay, well that's just to make this board a little more attractive. Here's an example of oak veneer core or hardwood veneer plywood. This little guy here is maple hardwood veneer plywood. This is a birch. It's more of a structural plywood. This is actually called Baltic birch. It has a lot more layers in it than a regular hardwood veneer plywood might have. Here's a better example of it right here. If you grab this, and hopefully you can see these different layers. It's called Baltic birch. Okay, so you should be able to see the difference in the number of layers between this VC core, this veneer core plywood, and this Baltic birch plywood. Baltic birch will generally have, depending on its overall thickness, anywhere from 9 to 13 layers that make it up. It makes it a lot more stable. Okay, so this is our regular veneer core, this is our Baltic birch. Now, some of the benefits of plywoods like this, these hardwood veneers. Okay. First of all, it takes what normally would not be that great looking, okay, and by placing a hardwood veneer on its face, you get something that supposedly looks like hardwood, like a solid piece of wood. Second thing about this stuff is really good. It is incredibly stable. In other words, it's not going to expand and contract a whole lot with changes in temperature and humidity. It's not going to sit there and expand and contract this way, or in thickness either. So in other words, what you get is a situation where it's not going to twist real bad. It's not going to bow real bad. It's not going to cut real bad. It can. I've seen sheets of plywood bow and twist and cut pretty bad before, but it's usually the less expensive construction grade plywoods. These hardwood veneer plywoods generally don't move at all. There's no expansion and contraction with humidity and temperature changes at all. Okay, so that's a real benefit. Second benefit, a lot of times, is cost. Okay, for what you pay for a sheet of 3/4 inch thick, and a sheet is 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. So what you pay for a sheet of this 3/4 inch cherry veneer plywood, depending on the grade that you wanted, you could probably get a sheet of this for about 75 bucks. It can go upwards of $200 for a sheet of it, but for a regular lower grade sheet of this stuff, about 75 bucks. You try and get solid cherry at 3/4 of an inch thick and get enough to make up a panel that's 4 feet wide and 8 foot long. That's going to be right around you're probably talking well into the $150 range. Okay? And you still have to work around defects and things like that in the solid wood. So it can save a lot of money. It's a lot more stable. A couple problems with it though. Number one, you cannot route the edges of this and create a decorative profile directly on this plywood. It cannot be done. The only thing you could do is take a piece of solid material. Let me grab it real quick. So, for example, if I have this oak hardwood veneer right here, okay, and let's say it's a shelf or something like that, and I want a decorative edge on here. I want something like this that looks kind of nice. It's got a decorative shape to it. I can't do that to this plywood, but what I can do is mount a piece of solid wood along this edge. Now I can route it, or I can mount it this way. Now I have a solid piece that I could actually route that decorative edge onto. Okay? So that's one way to do it. Another thing is, even if you don't want to route the edge, you can see this veneer core. You do not want to see that. We have a way around that as well. For example, this piece of cherry plywood right here, okay? I can see the veneer core. If I don't want to see it, we do this a lot here. I can buy solid wood edge banding. And so basically what this is this is actual cherry wood, all right? Made very, very thin. It's a veneer, but on the back, it's got a heat-activated glue. So we take a clothes iron. We have an old clothes iron sitting over here on the counter, and we can actually take this. This is a little wider than a 3/4 inch thick piece of material. We can actually take this and iron it onto the edge of the board, okay, and then trim it so it makes it seem to be a solid piece of wood. So that's one way to hide that veneer core that we don't want to see, okay? So that's something we can do to fight that drawback of being able to see those veneer cores. We can do the same thing to say what this is called a melamine. This is a black melamine. It's very similar to a regular veneer, hardwood veneer plywood. It's just got a plastic, I'm not even sure what exactly they call this stuff, but it's got a plastic surface on it, very, very thin again. But we can obviously see the particle board core, but we have black edge banding tape that we can actually iron onto that edge and hide that edge. We've got the same thing for white melamine. There's all different colors of melamine out there, and you can buy this iron-on edge banding in just about any color you want as well, so you can hide those edges in a project. The other nice thing about sheet goods, okay, we can buy this stuff any thickness we want, all right? We can buy it anywhere from 1/8 of an inch thick or less, all the way up to 1 inch, 1.5 inches thick. I mean, we can buy whatever thickness we want, which means that in the milling process, you do not have to thickness sheet goods, okay? There's two basic results from the thicknessing process in lumber, okay? And what those two things are, when you thickness a piece of lumber, which is part of our order of operations here, it accomplishes two things. The thicknessing process creates two parallel faces, okay? So if these faces were to extend out into space, they'd never diverge and they'd never get closer together. The other thing it does is it makes it a consistent thickness no matter where you measure it. All right, so if this is 3/4 of an inch here, our thicknessing process on solid stock would be 3/4 of an inch thick no matter where we measure the thickness. Sheet goods, it's already there. You don't have to do it. You do not have to thickness it. Okay, there's absolutely no thicknessing process in dealing with sheet goods. Solid stock, you do have to thickness it. We don't usually we don't have to worry about defects in sheet goods. We don't have to worry about cupping and bowing and twisting and things like that that would have to be fixed with solid wood. But there are drawbacks. It can be unsightly. It can be difficult to hide the edges. We can't, like I said, route the edges. It does have its drawbacks. So that's sheet goods, all right? There's 1,000 different types or more of sheet goods out there. Let's talk a little bit about solid stock. In our shop, we carry basically 6 different species of solid stock. For example, this is red oak. All right, you can see there's a knot in it that you're not going to get, Great. There's a knot here that you wouldn't see in sheet goods, all right? Usually these kind of defects are removed from the surfaces of whatever veneer they're gonna put on a piece of sheet goods, unless it's intended to be a rustic type of thing, like rusted pine or something where you want the knots showing. We have to deal with these defects, okay? You can see the crazy grain around here too, it's kind of nuts. But we have red oak here. We have poplar, which is another one of our hardwoods. Poplar can vary in color quite a bit, from dark blacks, even purples, to grays, bright greens, whites. Poplar's a really common, fairly inexpensive material that we use here. We have our hardest hardwood material here in maple, okay? Cutting boards, things like that. It's really hard, dense, closed grain wood. Mostly white in color overall. There can be some black or gray portions in it. One of the more common ones, this is our only softwood that we carry, and this is pine. All right, and there's a lot of versions of pine too. There's eastern white pine, there's all sorts of pine. Okay, but this is gonna be the softest material that we have in here. And then we have cherry, which is the most expensive hardwood that we keep in here. It runs about $4, I think $4.50 a board foot, something like that. So this is cherry, a very nice furniture wood. And then the last one we have is alder. Okay, alder is sometimes called the poor man's cherry because it can be finished or stained to look just like cherry. So this is our alder. So those are the 6 types of hardwood we have here, or solid stock, I should say, because pine's not a hardwood. So characteristics of solid stock. It takes a routed edge pretty well. In other words, you can put a nice profile or routed edge on solid stock. Let me show you, this oak one has a nice little edge on it. So you can see this, there we go. So there's a nice profile on this. So for drawer fronts, cabinet doors, things like that, edges of shelves and stuff, it routes and takes a decorative edge very well. And you're not exposing some kind of weird core like veneer core or something like that on plywood. So it takes that really well. It generally has, when used in furniture, a little warmer feel to it. You can tell by looking at a piece of furniture if it's made of solid wood or if it's got particle board or plywoods or something like that else, something else like that in it. You can generally tell once you start looking a little bit. In fact, if you go and look at your kitchen cabinets in your house, uppers or lowers, and you open the door, open the drawer, and look at the cabinets themselves, they are going to be plywood or particle board core cabinets. A dresser in your home, something like that, unless it was fairly expensive, it's going to have plywoods, things like that. Maybe the drawer fronts would be the only thing to be solid wood. Even then, some of them are MDF, the really cheap stuff, Walmart furniture, things like that. It machines very nicely. In other words, when I say it machines nicely, when you rip it or cross-cut it, it's generally a very clean cut. Whereas with hardwood veneers and things like that, especially when you cross-cut them, in other words, when you make a cut in hardwood plywood veneers across the grain this way, okay, it's going to tear out really bad. In fact, this oak had an example of tear out on it pretty bad, I think. This one right here. You can see the tear out when a cut was made across this way, all these little, you know, junky things. Solid stock doesn't tend to tear out as bad. It can in certain situations, but it's nothing like you deal with plywoods. Other benefits, pluses, pros of solid stock. And let's look at the cons. Okay, probably one of the biggest drawbacks of working with solid wood is wood movement, expansion and contraction of this material. Okay, these boards are just as they came out of the tree. In other words, a board like this would have been standing or would have been oriented this way in a tree. Okay, in other words, all the moisture, all the nutrients that come from the roots and get up to the leaves travel in this direction. So that means that this surface right here is end grain, and it's very receptive to moisture moving through that pathway, that end grain, and going this direction in a board. So in other words, basically what I'm saying is that expansion and contraction of solid wood can be excessive with changes in temperature and humidity. For example, this board, if it's going to move or expand and contract with changes in humidity and temperature, it's going to move this direction the most, all right? It's going to move this direction the least. You can't see that. And the same with changes in thickness. So in other words, changes in length along the grain and changes in thickness, not real bad. It's changes in the width of a board. So as moisture enters that end grain, it's going to expand and contract this way. That can be very, very detrimental to a piece of furniture. If you ever sat in a wooden chair that's all loose and rickety and all the pieces are creaking and falling apart, that's been due to expansion and contraction. As that joint, as those joints where the legs come together and everything have gotten larger and smaller and larger and smaller over the years, they tend to break that glue joint and make it basically come apart. We've got a couple chairs here that have had a problem like that in the past. So expansion and contraction is probably the biggest drawback. You can design furniture and build furniture to accommodate that expansion and contraction, but that has to be kept in mind. Okay, so that's probably the biggest drawback to this stuff. The second drawback to solid stock is it can be expensive. I mean, there's absolutely, look at walnut. If you want to make something out of walnut these days, I remember when walnut used to be around $5 a board foot. It's $7, $8 a board foot now, twice the cost of cherry almost. So it can be very expensive. It can be difficult to find certain solid stock anymore. The only dealer in hardwood lumber that would have oak, walnut, maple, cherry, things like that in Southern Oregon that I know of is a place called Beavertooth Oak in Medford. And the problem with those guys is they're open 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. They're not open on weekends. So it can be difficult to get lumber sometimes. In fact, most of the lumber that we use in this class actually comes from Eugene. I call in an order to Eugene, they load it, bring it down. You guys that have actually been here in the shop before know that every once in a while we'll have to unload a truck full of lumber. They come down once a week, so I can usually get lumber here pretty quickly. The problem is I don't get to pick it out. When it comes to the guitar class and some specialty lumber that students request, I actually go down to Beavertooth and hand select what we're buying, so it makes it a little better. So availability, cost, expansion and contraction are some of the things that are pretty bad. I've neglected to mention when it comes to hardwood veneers like this oak veneer or this cherry veneer, one of the problems we have is the veneer on the face, like this cherry here, it's so thin that if you take a power sander, you know, a palm sander or something like that, and want to sand this surface, if you're not very, very careful, you can actually sand right through this veneer and expose the core underneath. There you go. That would be huge if you made that mistake. When it comes to solid wood, if you sand a little too much, not gonna bother anything. Okay. The last and biggest probably drawback to solid stock, and this has to do with the fact that it moves, that it expands and contracts quite a bit with changes in temperature and humidity, is that it creates defects. And what I mean by that, it creates twists in your board. It can create bows, cups, which is this type of a defect, and those can be difficult to remove unless you follow a set pattern the way you do things and you follow the order of operations in the shop. It can be a little confusing, and they can be so bad that as you start to remove a defect like that, you end up taking it too thin or too skinny, and it ruins the board. Another thing, a lot of people think knots and stuff like that are defects that need to be cut around. Yes, in a lot of ways they can be. I don't think I'd want a knot like this in a tabletop. But these days, rustic furniture tends to, you go to Bend and sell somebody a knotty oak or a knotty pine table, you can probably get 10 times what it's worth up there, and more money and brains. But a lot of people like the rustic look with knots and things like that. Also, you get some really dramatic grain patterns around knots and in other areas. Okay, if you look at the grain patterns in this oak, that can be really cool when you put a stain on it. You're not going to see that in the face of a piece of plywood veneer. They clean that stuff out, it's taken care of. It's not, you know, you're paying for a good grade face on plywoods. So that's some of the basics about the differences in solid stock and sheet goods. We have hardwood lumber. We have softwood lumber in the way of pine, solid stock. Okay. And then we have our particle board core plywoods. We have our veneer core plywoods. We have MDF core plywoods. We have just straight particle board, straight MDF. A lot of different products to choose from. And it's just a simple matter of design considerations, monetary considerations, how much you can afford, what you want the final look to be, whether or not it needs to be very stable, or if a little bit of instability and expansion and contraction is acceptable and can be worked around. So there's a lot of different choices. Part of the difficulty in woodworking is choosing the right material for the application, its intended application. So there you go. That's an introduction to sheet goods and solid stock. Get all that? Be a test tomorrow on all that information. 50 questions. Half of them essay, a quarter of them multiple choice, and then the other quarter, I don't know, I'll make something up. No, I'm kidding. There's not going to be a test on that. Don't worry about it. All right. So that's pretty much it for the day. All right. Thank you guys for getting here. Especially thank you for getting here on time. And you guys have a nice afternoon, evening. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you all tomorrow. Okay? Bye-bye, folks.